It always takes a moment. All right, so that's good to go.
Oops.
All right, everybody. Thank you guys for joining us here at our November monthly program. It's great to see everyone's face. I hope everyone's getting prepared for the Thanksgiving feasts. Before we get started with our regular program, as always, we have a few announcements to go over. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. All right. And let's minimize this. All righty. So first and foremost, I want to extend a big thank you to everyone who donated on Give Miami Day. We had a pretty successful one this year. Of course, that's thanks to everyone who chipped in. And it really allows us to continue doing what we do. So if you donated, a very big thank you to you. We don't have a ton of events coming up. We're gearing up for our December break, so we're not going to have a program, but there are a few things happening. Firstly, on Saturday, December 11th, we will have our next chapter field trip. It's going to be held at Simpson Park in City of Miami. One of my favorite spots. There's a lot of plants that you can find there that you really don't find anywhere else in Miami. That field trip's going to run from 9 to 11 a.m. and it will be led by Steve Woodmansey. Upcoming is on Saturday, December 18th, will be our chapter work day at the Ernest F. Coe Visitor Center in Everglades National Park. That will run from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. If you're a new volunteer, there is some paperwork that you have to sign. So if you're interested in volunteering, please contact Patty Fairs. Her email is pasted here on the slide. And then we have on Tuesday, January 25th, our next chapter program. The topic is still to be determined, but the info will be added as soon as possible in the chapter calendar, and it will also be available in the upcoming January newsletter. Lastly, just so everyone is aware, we're going to be using a new email distribution platform. So in the past, we've used vertical response, but kind of trying to get in with all this hip new technology coming up, we're switching over to MailChimp. Just in preparation for that, if you could please add our datefmps email, so that's datefmps@gmail.com, to your contact list, and that will help avoid any of the emails, including the ones that have the newsletters, to help avoid those going into the spam folder. We do have a few new members that I'd like to just welcome to the chapter. So a big welcome to Noah Frade, Leslie McKinley, Daniela Menendez, James Ortiz Lane, Diana Lane, Christina Peterson, Robert Pope, Peck Pope, and Veronique Tessier. A big welcome to the chapter. You guys being part of it helps us continue what we do, helping us continue to promote the preservation, conservation, and restoration of the native plants and native plant communities here in South Florida. If you're interested in learning more about our chapter, we have several social media handles. We have Facebook, which I guess now is going to be called Meta for whatever reason. We have Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. We have our website, and if you have any questions at any point, we also have our email down below. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight's program. So tonight we have Dr. Amanda Bourque, who will be giving a presentation titled The Restoration of Spoil Lands in Biscayne National Park. Just as a quick introduction to Dr. Bourque, Dr. Amanda Bourque is a supervisory ecologist at Biscayne National Park, where she has led the habitat restoration program since 2003. Amanda's expertise lies in marine and restoration ecology, and she has completed dozens of ecological restoration projects in the park's coral reefs, seagrass meadows, and coastal forests. she has also forged strong partnerships with organizations that share a common goal of conservation and stewardship of the park's resources. Originally from Maine, Amanda lives in Redlands, where she enjoys spending time with her son and husband and training wild Mustang horses. I would love to hear about that last point, actually, about the horses. Amanda, thank you so much for joining us today, and you could go ahead and get started when you're ready.
Great. We'll just turn on my video here for a second to say hello to everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, great. Well, I'm very happy to be here. I have a slight disclaimer that I'm here. The husband is not here, but the son and the 4-month-old puppy are here. And so what could possibly go wrong with that combination? So if there's any interruptions, you'll know why, and I apologize in advance for that. So being out in the Redland where I am, I have not the best internet connection. I'm going to turn off my video and start my screen share for the presentation. Let's see. All right.
All right.
Did that work? Yeah. Can everybody see my screen now?
Mm-hmm.
All right, great. Well, yes, thank you so much for the introduction. And I've been working at the park for a number of years now, and I'm usually in the water or under the water. And about 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to work on coastal forest restoration in the park. This was new to me. I hadn't done this type of work before. And so it's been quite a journey. We've wrapped up several projects during that 10-year period, most recently this summer. And your illustrious member, Jeannie Rothschild, has been my bestest volunteer on these projects. And she connected me with your organization, so invited me to come tonight. So I just wanted to talk to you about, tell the story of what we've been doing with our forest restoration projects in the park. And we've learned a few things along the way that can inform us in the future and hopefully others too. So I would like to get started now. We are, I'm sure most of you know where Biscayne National Park is, but basically we're mostly a marine park, and we extend from Key Largo in the north, in the Key Biscayne in the north, pretty much down to Key Largo in the south. And we have this narrow mangrove shoreline along our western edge, a large expanse of the southern portion of Biscayne Bay. We have the northernmost Florida Keys, and then we have a big chunk of the Florida Reef Tract. So we have this wonderful continuum of habitats and ecosystems, from mangroves all the way out to coral reefs. In Miami-Dade County, Miami-Dade County was developed long before the park was in existence. And to drain the Everglades, as I'm sure most of you know, a series of canals were dredged all across the county. And where those canals met the ocean, met the shores of Biscayne Bay, the spoils were deposited into islands and peninsulas. And so thus were created many spoil islands throughout the county in the coastal waters. Spoil islands are problematic for a number of reasons, environmental reasons. They're typically invaded by exotic plant species. They're basically piles of rock and gravel and dirt. So they're eroding shorelines, usually lead to water clarity, water quality issues in the shallow waters, which can affect the adjacent seagrass meadows. And they're also locations where we see just a tremendous accumulation of marine debris. So spoil islands are definitely problematic from an environmental standpoint. So what can be done about this? We're not unique in Miami-Dade County. Many coastal areas in Florida and elsewhere have spoil islands that were created during various dredging projects. And a lot of folks have done wonderful things with these areas in terms of restoration. They can be enhanced and modified for purposes of conservation, recreation, education. These are a couple of images of spoil islands that have been restored to create different types of habitats. Here in Miami-Dade County, there's an extensive list of spoil island restoration projects, all the way from the county line in the north down to areas that are just north of the park boundary, such as Key Biscayne. And unfortunately, when I started learning about spoil area restoration, I learned that some of the last unrestored spoil areas in the county are actually in Biscayne National Park, which is a little bit counterintuitive, but it was the truth at the time. And so where exactly are these areas in our park? The left image is a picture of our park boundary, and you can just see the tip of Key Biscayne up in the north end. And here we have this. Are you seeing my cursor as well?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay, great. So down here is the Ocean Reef Club, just to give you some perspective. The park headquarters is here. Turkey Point power plant is here. So there are 3 canals that empty into the bay along the shoreline. And if we go to the middle panel, we'll see the C102, also known as the Princeton or Moody Canal, is just south of Black Point Marina. Black Point is this area here. There's Military Canal, which empties out due east of the Homestead Air Reserve Base. And then just south of that is Maori Canal, which is also known as C103. And I guess my images here they're kind of dark. It's a little bit hard to see. But at each one of these areas, there's usually at least one peninsula and then a couple of islands that stick out into the bay. And so when we started looking at these areas, people have been looking at these areas on and off. But when I started looking at these areas, I looked at, what were the conditions out there at the time. And this is an aerial, a pre-restoration aerial of the 2 spoil islands at the C102 canal. And it looks kind of nice from space, but on the ground, you see they're just in really bad shape, very mature communities of really nasty plants and trees that we don't like to see in our environment, especially in a national park. So the three main players in our exotic plant communities on those islands are seaside mayho, Brazilian pepper, and Asiatic latherleaf, and very, very mature communities of all 3. So in 2012, a couple of things led to us having a need to identify coastal forest restoration projects in the park. And that led me to, develop a restoration process for this type of work. I had done this type of work in the marine environment, seagrass restoration, coral reef restoration, but as I mentioned before, never with coastal forests. I learned that we need to do a variety of steps, topographic and vegetation surveys. We need to design our restoration projects. We need to do NEPA compliance, which is National Environmental Policy Act compliance, that whenever a federal agency does any sort of work, we have to look at the environmental impacts of that work. A number of other planning steps, regulatory permitting. We're going to hire contractors, so we need to go through a contracting process and then do the actual projects and then monitor the results. And so we started doing some survey work on our islands, and here are some pictures of that process, which we began in 2012. These are topographic surveys. Now, I mentioned before that I'm a marine biologist, right? So I didn't know what I was doing. Fortunately, I had some wonderful people step up to help me out. People who cared a lot about the park and who were experts in their field, their respective fields. Gary Milano from Durham, first and foremost, I'm sure many of you know him. He's retired from Durham now, but he was very, very involved in the early stages of this work. and really was so generous in his knowledge and really helped me out in terms of plotting these projects out. Sal El-Rubai works for our lands office in Naples, Florida, and he was a land surveyor in his former life. And so he was able to help us with the topographic surveys on the islands. And Tony Pernis, also with the Park Service, used to be our lead for invasive plant management team. And so Tony was really well-versed at managing invasive plants in Park Service lands. And he kind of helped us come up with an approach for clearing the exotics off of these project areas. So I'm always sure to thank these three people whenever I talk about this work, because absolutely I couldn't have done it without them. So thanks, guys. All right. So we first decided, we needed to establish our restoration goals. We wanted to stabilize the shorelines and slopes of these islands in order to provide higher quality coastal habitat. And these cool 3D models on the sidebar here are work that we came up with from our survey data. We had conducted vegetation surveys around the perimeter. The dots are different mangrove species and native trees that we wanted to maintain and not disturb during our restoration process. And so we decided that the actions that we would do to achieve those goals were to selectively clear exotic vegetation, regrade upland topography into stable zones that were favorable for native plant communities, and then we would plant salt-tolerant native vegetation appropriate to the different zones that we had created through the regrading process. And so these are just a couple of quick models of our survey data of the two C102 islands. And on the left side is what the survey told us the existing conditions were. Excuse me. And on the right is what we had come up with for a restoration design for these areas. We were going to be lowering the elevation in some areas to be more conducive to mangrove growth, scraping down and leveling out some other areas. So, excuse me, I'm coming off of the flu, so I have a frog in my throat here. So we went through a contracting process. We were all ready to start, and then basically our contracting process imploded. And it was fairly arduous to get to that point. And so rather than going back to square one to start the whole process over, we decided to simplify our efforts. We decided to scrap the regrading work, the topographic restoration work, and we decided simply to clear exotic vegetation and plant the salt-tolerant native vegetation into these areas. In this way, we were simplifying the project. We were also dramatically reducing the cost. So we figured that we would be able to restore more areas if we did not spend as much money on the topographic restoration. So this is our kind of our 2.0 restoration design. So we were working in several different areas over the past several years. And rather than go through each area one at a time, I'm just sort of presenting general timelines of when we did what at different locations. So at the C102 canal, there were 3 areas we worked at. We worked at the Eastern Spoil Island, the Western Spoil Island, and also the Peninsula. And then at the C103 canal, we worked on the Peninsula. And our process for exotics removal, pretty straightforward. Get out there with some chainsaws. We typically bring a chipper to the work location, and we chip the cut trees and branches and brush. We chip them on site. It is definitely challenging though, because these areas are islands and or peninsulas that you can't really access by roads. And so we have a couple of landing crafts at the park where we figured out, and this is Tony Pernis's genius, that we could load a small chipper onto these vessels using an ATV or UTV. And there's a couple areas on each of the islands that are a flat enough slope that you can drive the equipment up onto the island. So this made the work a lot easier, even though it was definitely an operation to get the equipment out there. So we cut and clear the exotics on site, chip on site, and then treat with herbicide as we're moving through an area. Because we're bringing out these fairly small size chippers, I think it's like a 4-inch or 6-inch diameter chipper. We can't fit everything we're cutting. You can see the size of the logs that were, some of these Maho trees were gigantic, and some pretty substantial pepper as well. So the logs that were too big to chip, we loaded into bagsters, which are these sort of portable dumpster things, and brought them back to park headquarters. And then we just put them in a landfill, unfortunately, but we had to do it. At one of our sites, we couldn't get a chipper to the site. And it was also very large. The peninsula at C102 is pretty long. It's a large area. And so what we did is we actually had some contracted assistance for clearing this area. We had the contractor make large brush piles. We were able to work with Everglades National Park, their prescribed burn unit, and they conducted a controlled burn for us in this area, which worked out well, really well. Unfortunately, everything was delayed by COVID, but basically this area was cleared and the brush was stacked in December of 2019, right before the pandemic hit. And I think by the time they did the burning, it was in June of 2020. So we had a little bit of a delay during that time, but it worked out very well. So here's a couple of images of what these sites look like after we're done clearing the exotics. The top image and the bottom right are areas that we cleared with the chipper approach. And then the bottom left is the area that we did the controlled burn on of the brush. So we have a pretty clean slate to start with here. So then we move into planting. We did our first planting back in September and October of 2015, and that was on the C102 East Island. And that is where I first met Jeannie. In June of 17, and then skipping forward, which I'll explain later, we did the C102 West Island. And then in September of 2020, and continuing on in June of 21, we did the C102 Peninsula. And then just this past May, we did the C103 Peninsula. And it's definitely a mission to get the plants out to these sites. But again, these are our handy landing crafts that we have. We had the C103 Peninsula was the only one we were able to actually drive plants to with a vehicle. So we would load up our plants into a truck and drive them over there. But otherwise, we are moving these plants. We have to load them onto a boat, drive the boat over to the site, and then offload them on the island or the peninsula. So this is probably what will get you guys most interested, but this is the plants. This is the plant list that we were operating off of. We didn't plant all of these species at every site. I consulted with Gary and other botanists that work for the Park Service to come up with this list. But basically, you know, we're looking for salt tolerant native species that are native to South Florida. And, you know, they're on islands subject to inundation, lots of salt spray, not a lot of water sometimes. So, you know, they not great soil either. So really we need these species to be already adapted to living in this environment. So this is the sort of the master list. And we did choose many of these species for each site, but the complete list did not go in at every site. And we would get the plants delivered to park headquarters at Convoy Point, and then bring them to the sites, usually within a few days of when we received them. And we would just keep them happy and watered at the park until we were ready to use them. So when we got to a site, we tried to most of the time use these portable augers. The spoil areas, it's not solid rock like you would find on the mainland. So these are, these are dredge spoils. So it's not, limestone reef substrate. So you can actually dig a hole. It's not a lot of fun to dig a hole with a shovel, but it's doable. But we would try to bring this ground auger out to the site to lay in the larger holes, and that worked out pretty well. So our plant list in total had 29 species across all of the project areas that I mentioned, the 4 project areas. We put in an estimate of 6,000 plus trees, shrubs, and grasses. We purchased our plants from primarily from nurseries in Homestead, though some material we did get from a nursery in Loxahatchee. And our plant sizes ranged quite a bit, from 2-inch liners all the way up to 15-gallon pot sizes. In the lessons learned category, we learned to sort of balance the difficulty in digging holes with the knowledge that the larger pot sizes typically do better. But some areas there's just not a lot of soil to dig, so you couldn't get a larger pot size in. And a couple spots in this presentation, you'll see the gold star. See if you recognize this lady over here, hard at work. That's Jeannie digging holes on one of our islands. So for the first couple of projects we did, it was pre-COVID, and we had wonderful experiences recruiting volunteers to help us with the planting. We learned that local universities have community service requirements. And so we got a lot of enthusiastic FIU students primarily from FIU, who graciously donated their time to come out and help us plant. And this is not, as I'm sure you all know, this is not really a walk in the park, so to speak, to do this work. It's extremely arduous. We're usually out there in the hottest months of the summer because it's also rainy season. It's usually very hot and sunny. There's usually a lot of bugs. It's really hard work, and we're digging holes in very rocky ground. So we were super appreciative of all the volunteers who came out. And it was just, as planting often is, a very feel-good activity experience that was enjoyed by all. But post-COVID, we weren't able to, all our projects got put on hold. We missed a whole year and a half, basically. And we weren't able to gather large groups of volunteers. We were able to have small work teams of Park Service employees. And so we decided just to move ahead with that approach rather than continuing to wait for who knows how long before we could get volunteer groups together. We were able to have 1 or 2 volunteers on the projects this summer. And so we used my team and a couple of other amazing Park Service staff from neighboring offices to come and help us. These are just a couple images of what a site looks like right after we're done planting or in the planting process. It's pretty sparse looking. We're trying to not put in super high density. We usually have, shrubs and trees being spaced out, sort of like you see in the top left image. And then we will go in at the end and put in smaller plugs of grass and sort of liner sized things to help establish the ground cover. So this is just what it looks like after planting. And then this is kind of a neat image that somebody flew over us after we had just finished planting the C102 East Island. And you can see the plants laid out there. Doesn't look like much at the beginning, but I failed to mention too, but it's probably somewhat obvious that when we're clearing vegetation, we're leaving the mangroves and buttonwoods intact that are already there at the islands, and sea grapes. Those are primarily the native trees that were present. So that's why you see this fringe around that perimeter of the island. So a couple interesting things happened. I'm going to talk about those next. Here's a picture of the C102 Islands in March of 2017, just from Google Earth. The yellow dots are just our monitoring locations, but the island on the right, the eastern island, that had been planted a year and a half prior to this. So you can see, we're getting pretty good coverage of, let's see, that's this island here. So this is right when we planted. This is a year and a half later. Doing pretty well. The West Island, we had started clearing the summer before, and we were just about done clearing this year. And this year, which was 2017, we went on to plant this island in June and July of 2017. You might know where this is heading, because the next thing that happened in 2017 was Hurricane Irma in September. In this part of Biscayne Bay, we had a 7-foot+ storm surge. These islands were completely inundated for, I don't know exactly how long, but like the better part of a day. It was a substantial inundation for them. And these islands basically had severe impacts from Hurricane Irma. And on the western island that we had just planted a month and a half before, we basically lost everything. We lost everything we had planted, with the exception of this little patch on the far western end, because that was the highest elevation. I think that's a +10 area. And so the storm surge didn't get up that high. And what was planted there, for the most part, survived. But everything else in this area just got completely washed away. It just wasn't established yet. The loose sediment, the gravel just got completely worked and regraded. It was pretty impressive to see. Whereas the eastern island over here that had been planted a year and a half prior, we definitely saw some losses there. The bigger trees that had been growing up, a lot of them were toppled, but a lot of the vegetation that we had planted was still very much intact and survived. The fringing vegetation, the mangroves and buttonwoods, were heavily wind damaged. I think I already mentioned all the plantings were lost except for this crown area. And here's an image, couple of images here where you can just see how the gravel and rock just got completely worked. These are some pictures from 9 months later. We went out just to sort of see what we were dealing with on these two islands, and really noticed a lot of differences between the two and a couple of really interesting things. So here we have, this is that crown that I spoke of on the one island that didn't get totally inundated. What we had planted here was doing quite well. You can see in the foreground, there's a mayho that we had cut that's springing back. So we have to, keep treating that. But the other things that we planted were doing very well. On the top right, this is an image where you can see the surface of the island just got completely it was like a sandbox. And then we started to see recruitment of things that were presumably from the seed bank on the island, including a lot of native species. And the one thing that was really surprising to us, this bottom right image, basically all the green you see are buttonwood recruits. It was like a carpet of buttonwood coming in there. And we did not intend for a buttonwood monoculture to happen out there. That wasn't our goal, but hey, it's doing well out there. It's native and it's obviously thriving in those conditions. So we were happy to see that, those coming in. Same day on the other island, the C102 Island, which was planted in 2015, there were a lot of impacts, wind, and we did lose some plants, but there was tremendous resilience out there. Everything you see basically was planted in 2015, and some version of it was persisting past these tremendous storm impacts. And some of the grasses that we planted as a ground cover with the intent of suppressing the reemergence of exotics until the natives could take over, they were really doing their job very well. The wild lime was doing incredibly well. It's like massive thickets of lime out there. Jamaican dogwood, the canopies were, 20 feet high. And this is even after a hurricane. So we were pleasantly surprised at how this island was bouncing back. So how are we doing now? When I say now, we're in 2021, but remember, we don't have, we kind of did lose some time on the monitoring because of COVID. So now we have to take the term now with a little bit of a grain of salt. So I'm going to talk about our present conditions in a couple of different ways. So visually, just if you're out walking around, now these are pictures from 2019, but you're seeing a big difference out there. You're seeing, the 2015 images are these mature communities of Mayho and Pepper, tall canopies. It was completely shaded. It was totally different scene than you see out there now. The 2019 images, the top picture is from that eastern island that was planted in 2015. So it's really come back very nicely, very mature, very dense vegetation of a number of different species. And the bottom images of the western islands that we lost everything. But you can see those buttonwoods have really come in and have grown up quite a bit in that period of time. If we look at our monitoring data, we see a couple of interesting things. We see that canopy replacement is occurring, and that's not surprising because we cut down the old canopy, right, and put in a new canopy essentially, or a new species to make a new canopy. But if you look at the tallest trees out there, we now have buttonwood, dogwood, white mangroves, which were there already, and then we have Burma reed, which is not a native species. We'll talk about that again in a minute. We also have a much more diverse plant community. Again, somewhat not surprising because we removed the old plant community, which was low diversity, just primarily those 3 invasive species. And we planted, in some cases, 20 plus different species at the site. Not all of them survived, but many of them did. And now the plant communities out there are dominated by native species and not exotic species. We have a really nice developing low and shrub layer coming in. And, the species that are still out there are doing very, very well. And I have the caveat here, but maintenance is needed because we do see reemergence of the exotics that were removed coming in. So we do need to be persistent in getting out there and treating those. And one of the islands, the eastern one, the required maintenance diminishes every time we go out there. So it's the natives are really establishing themselves and doing well. So this is just kind of a fun way to view changes at the sites through Google Earth. And we have some really nice imagery of these sites. So I'll just walk you through these really quick. The top right here is our pre-restoration, if you will. So this is what it looked like when we started. And then we go to January of 2016. They seem to shoot once a year, more or less, of this area. You can see the eastern island has been cleared and planted in January of 16. Go up to March of 17. Our eastern island is, the plants are growing up nicely, and we are about 3/4 of the way clearing the western island. December 17 is after Irma. You can see the impacts from Irma and this little patch over here that didn't get inundated. I just repeated the December 17 up here for reference. We go a year later to December 18, still pretty bare. The eastern island is coming in really nicely. February of 20, big difference. on the western island. You can see those buttonwoods are really coming in. We hadn't done any supplemental planting at this point in time. We were seeking funding to do so. However, because of COVID, we had to put that on hold. So as of this point in time, February 20, we had not gone in and planted anything else. So this, all the difference between Irma basically and, 3 years later, that's all natural recruitment with the exception of this little patch that didn't get washed away. And the Eastern Island is doing famously. And then the most recent Google Earth image is from January of 21. So we should see another one pretty soon in the next few months, and it'll be interesting to see how that goes. We did a little bit of supplemental planting out here this summer. It wouldn't be evident in this image because we were out there in June. But basically we got out there and there was no open space left because everything, primarily natives, had come in and just taken up all the space on their own. So we put in a few units here and there, but really we weren't able to even find space to do any additional planting there. So that's good news. Just as a recap, this is before we started. This is more or less where we are today. And we are replacing that forest structure, the height, the canopy, the density, and increasing the species diversity, but doing so with native species rather than exotic invasive species. So the peninsula, I'll just show you some quick images of the C102 Peninsula in the same way. January 16, this is before we started. December of 17 image, this is after Irma. So we hadn't done any work out there, but you can see there were some hurricane impacts. You can see some bare spots, especially along that south edge. There's a tremendous wind shear on the mangroves in that area. December 18, you can kind of see some dead brush, and the branches that had broken down are dead and just sort of lying around the site. We came in a year later, December 19, and did the clearing of this area. And our contractor made the brush piles, which you can see very nicely in this bottom image, all the little piles stacked up along the spine of this peninsula and a couple big ones over at the end. And then I'll just add this one more image on from January of 21. So now here we have our before and our after. It still looks pretty sparse, but you can see our plantings here, the little sort of speckled green dots here throughout the site. And these are actually doing really well. We're almost a year later now, and the vegetation is quite a bit larger. So I'm eager to see the next round of imagery. We do have partners who fly this area. We're not doing any formal aerial monitoring, but sometimes we're able to get, just sort of casual shots of the area. But having the Google Earth imagery is really nice for repeatability and just sort of tracking it through time. So I mentioned that we've learned something about the plants that we're using. We have some winners and we definitely have some losers. I've just run through this list and marked a few with stars that have done extremely well out there. And I've put a strike through on some names that haven't done well. And I think they haven't done well for a couple different reasons. Perhaps they needed more water to start out with. Some species actually are getting eaten like overnight when we put them out there. And I think that's largely due to iguanas that live out on the site. So we're losing things like sea purslane, which we like to have as the low elevation, almost intertidal area. But, those are just, we call them iguana snacks because they're just gone the next day. So, we've learned that in some areas, it just doesn't make sense to spend money and plant them because they're just not going to make it until we are better at managing our iguana populations. The wild lime doing incredibly well. So I feel very happy about where these islands are and how these plant communities are developing, but there are threats to the success of these projects. The pressure that humans are putting on the site just is never ending. People recreate, some people try to live out there at these sites. There's definitely some hobo jungle action going on in some locations. People are out there fishing a lot. Now that the bike spurs kind of extend down to the end of the canal roads, there's a lot more people out there, and they leave their trash behind, and they light fires and they trample our plants. And I'm sort of looking forward to these plants getting big enough that they don't get stepped on as much. We're not able to restrict access to these areas. We're not attempting to make these public destinations in any way. But it would be nice. It will be nice when the plants get big enough that they're not quite as at risk from the visitors who use those areas. And then, of course, the ever-present threat of reemerging exotics. Like I said, constant vigilance is important at these sites until the natives come in and become dominant. And then it's a much easier situation to manage. But when there's open space, you have to stay on it, because otherwise we'll go out, if we miss a few months, go out, 3 or 6 months later, we definitely have a lot of issues to take care of. So all of these experiences we've had have taught us something about how we can design resilience into these restoration projects. We've seen how the plants they don't all respond in the same way to the different locations we're putting them. They're variably susceptible to disturbance, such as hurricane disturbance, such as predation. We see different patterns of post-storm recruitment. We know that we have to but we have to consider the timing of the planting to take advantage of our rainy seasons. In real life and federal government world, that's challenging sometimes. It would be nice to be able to go out and, when you have free time or when it's cool and windy, but in the winter is not the time that we want to do these projects, because we're not able to provide supplemental watering in most cases. Though we have in a couple of instances at the beginning of just when the plants were planted. So the timing of the planting really does need to be considered. We need to consider our plant list. These aren't research projects per se. We may not be able to say exactly why some species didn't do as well as others, but we do know that, it has something to do with environmental tolerance, the ability to survive inundation, because that's going to keep happening, right? We're going to get more storms that will have storm surge of those magnitudes, and these islands will be inundated again. So we learned a lot about what species made it through that type of disturbance and which ones didn't. We know that, going back to the timing point, we know that, if plants can become established, if they have a little bit of time to get established, then they're going to fare better that type of inundation or wave damage. So if those root systems can become established, then they have a fighting chance. So again, that's, we try to, let's maybe plant at the very beginning of rainy season, maybe at the end of May or early June, so that at least they're in the ground for a few months before the likelihood of hurricanes increases towards the end of the hurricane season. We also, had unexpected herbivory, like I mentioned, and most of it we think is from invasive species like iguanas. We do have an iguana management program at our park, but it's hard, it's one of many things that we have to manage, and it's hard to get out to the islands, and it's sometimes hard to get them, and it's seasonally easier to get them when it's cold, you know, but when it's the summertime and it's hot, it's very hard to manage that species. Another iguana thing that we learned is that they like to make nests in our mulch piles. So when we're chipping this material on site, we would find iguana nests. And so we want to make sure that we're not leaving mulch around the site, making sure that we, you know, spread it out. The mulch piles are from the chipper. We're not bringing out bagged mulch, but we want to make sure that we don't leave it around in piles that are deep enough for this nesting behavior to occur. And then, as I mentioned, that maintenance is incredibly important to keep the reemergence at a minimum. So what are our next steps? These are close-ups of those remaining unrestored spoil areas in the park. And I've just put some little check marks on here on the areas that we have done. There's some more to do. We are at the moment out of our funding that we had to do this work. And the remaining work, especially, oh, I have my labels wrong, I'm sorry. The center image is Military Canal and the right image is the Maori Canal. I would really like to work on these two islands off the Maori Canal, but they're very high. They have a very high vertical. I think they're plus 14 feet. And so they really are going to involve, to do those islands right, they're going to kind of need to be probably scraped down, at least partially. And that's going to be very, very expensive. And we certainly don't have that magnitude of funding anywhere on the horizon for that type of work. But to the extent that we can work in the lower elevations of those areas and manage the invasive species that are there, that's still beneficial, and we'll still most likely try to continue working on those areas, sort of that low-hanging fruit. It's not a complete solution, but it's a solution that is still, you know, worthwhile, beneficial to the environment. And so many people have contributed to this work over the past 10 years. I'm sure I've forgotten some people here, but lots of Park Service folks, lots of county folks, some key folks of the district. This work has been funded from a couple of different sources, through some various Park Service funding channels, but also we have gotten some grants from the South Florida National Parks Trust, which is now known as the Alliance for Florida's National Parks. So we're very appreciative of that support. And just a couple of cute shots of critters out there, just as a reminder of who is benefiting from this work. The wildlife are using these areas, and so we are thrilled when we go out there and we see manatees around the islands and fledgling vultures and turtles. And one of the islands we named Dragonfly Key because it just has these massive swarms of dragonflies that come through there every summer. So it's really rewarding to see these islands flourish, as they're man-made islands, they're human-made islands, but at least we can try to create natural communities on them to benefit the native wildlife in the area. And so with that, I would like to say thank you and happy Thanksgiving to everybody. And I'm available for any questions if anybody has any.
Truly wonderful work, Amanda. You know, with a background in coastal restoration myself, you know, seeing this is just absolutely incredible. I do see on chat that there are a few questions that were asked during your presentation. I'm not sure if you can open up chat to take a look at them.
Yes, let me see.
The first one I see is from Leslie. Actually, no, from Gwen at 7:55 p.m.
Okay. Gwen. Okay. Blowing rocks. Vegetation. Went to a restoration field trip at Blowing Rocks many years ago. They did pile burning of their Australian pines and later noticed the vegetation that recruited where the burn was much thinner and different species than outside the burn footprint. Have you noticed anything like that on the islands where we burn the large debris? So we've only burned in the one area, and it's only been, it hasn't been that long. It was June of 2020 that we burned. I think of that area as two, that sort of there's two parts of that peninsula. One part is a large mound on the eastern end, and there's actually a fairly good soil layer there. And the spine of the peninsula, which connects it to the mainland, is very thin layer of soil, super rocky boulders, you know, not very hard to plant there. What I notice about those areas that there's not a lot growing in the spine area. And I think that's just because there's not a lot of soil there. And also people walk there a lot and things are getting trampled. But the other end where there is a larger soil layer there, things are doing really well. Everything that we planted there is doing great. So no, I don't know how similar the sites are, but I haven't noticed, for example, bare patches where the burns were. No, I haven't noticed any. You know, we planted over the burn piles, you know, over the burn footprints, but I haven't noticed that there's that those plantings are doing differently or growing differently than non-burned areas. All right, let's see. Oh, Jeannie, thank you. It's awesome working with you too. We did not use torchwood. Actually, wait, I will take that back. We did put some torchwood in. It's a little bit hard to get. And yes, we did put torchwood on two of our islands. One of the one that was inundated, we lost it all, except for maybe a handful. The other island where the lime has just gone berserk out there. And so it's hard to tell actually if the torchwood is still there, because you would be having to get in the middle of this giant lime thicket. And so I don't know if it's still there. It certainly hasn't flourished to the extent that some of the other plants have flourished. How did you decide where to put your trees versus shrubs and ground cover? And did you leave open areas that were mostly ground covers? How did I decide? So Gary Milano helped me decide. We considered, you know, coastal zonation and where we would expect plants to do well. Trees and shrubs are going to be, you know, trees at the higher elevations, shrubs in the middle elevations, and smaller things as we get down. For ground cover, we did plant a lot of grasses and some vines that were intended to be ground cover. And did we leave them open? Not big areas like intentionally, but our plantings are fairly spaced apart so that there is open space in between them. I'm not sure if that answers the question. The invasive strike team is not in existence in its former state. If we're talking about the same type of, they used to hire a seasonal crew of people that would go around to the different Park Service units. And they changed that model a few years ago. So we don't have that strike team. And instead, they distribute the funds out to the different parks through a ranking process. So we do have money for invasive plant treatment. The treatment is not happening through the strike team anymore. It's typically contracted out. So we know that, you know, we apply for funds for a given year, we get X dollars, we hire a contractor to do X amount of work. But the treatments are treatments only, they're not active restoration in the form that we did in these particular projects. Are we concerned about erosion in this area? In the short term, yes. In the long term, no. We didn't do, I think the plants are coming in well enough that they're going to anchor the soil. We didn't remove anything from around the edges of the islands. The mature mangroves and buttonwoods were left in place, and sea grapes in a lot of cases. Riprap is not part of the project design in any of these sites. So yeah, we're not, I don't know about the spoil islands in the middle of the bay. I haven't been there. Ours are fairly rocky. So there's going to be erosion, but there's also a lot of rock material that's not going anywhere. Privet didn't do well. Yep, didn't do well. I don't know why. Don't know why. I don't have an explanation. When we planted privet, it was at the end of the rainy season. We did do supplemental watering for a few weeks. It's possible it wasn't enough for it to get established. It's possible it got out competed by something else. Not sure. Interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Well, I'm willing to try it again, but it didn't do well for us so far. Vandalism of the plantings. Okay, so it's been a little while since I was out there. I haven't seen intentional vandalism. There's enough open space there that people are probably, there's more open space there now than there was. So I think just talking to the fishermen out there who are using those areas, they've expressed appreciation that they can now walk easily from one end of the area to the other. And I haven't seen intentional vandalism. Will a pathway be kept open as people use these areas? I don't know. It remains to be seen. There was a kind of pathways there already. The one island that our first island that we did in 2015 is so dense that you can't walk through the site now. We can't even get through it to monitor. So if that is the trajectory we're on, there won't be open space out there for much longer. Low tolerance for inundation. Thank you, Barbara. Good to know. Maybe that's why they didn't do well. There is not signage. Signs in the Park Service are complicated, shall we say. It's not that it wouldn't be a good idea. These are areas where they're not maintained as public areas. You know, we're not trying to make them destinations or anything like that. It's just not straightforward to put up restoration signs. I think they could be useful because, especially at the peninsula sites, because those are accessible from those bike paths and the levee roads. The islands less so. People aren't generally like pulling their boats up to those islands. Honestly, we don't really want people to access the sites. And so that's just one of the many complicating factors in deciding whether or not to put up signs. And then I can just blame everything on COVID too, because we're also behind at this point that the topic of putting up signs where it might seem like a straightforward thing is not straightforward at all. Please, eel. Yes, yes, yes. I will certainly keep eel in mind if we ever get to that point. Is that Mava? Hey, Mava. Why is 14 foot elevation a problem? Key Largo is also pretty high because it's a tiny, skinny little spoil island that I don't even know how they got the pile up that high. It's very narrow. So when you're walking along the top of the island, it's sort of like a knife edge. It's not problematic. It's just there's no surface area up there to plant. And the slopes are so steep because the island is so narrow that you wouldn't want to invest a lot of money in trying to stabilize those, scraping down would be really the only way to stabilize them. And if you look at the exposed faces of those areas, they're massively eroding. So anytime we get a big storm, if there's wave action, or storm surge or really high tides, those steep slopes are just, obviously eroding away. Do you hope to plant mangroves in this area? I do not plan to plant mangroves in this area, in these areas, because right now the elevation is not suitable for them. Remember, these are spoil piles. They're not naturally occurring shorelines. So in order to, where the elevations are suitable for mangroves, there are mangroves growing, there are mature mangroves growing. I see you, I'll go on to your next question in a sec, but with sea level rise, could parts of these islands become more suitable for mangroves? Sure, I'm sure they could. Will mangroves naturally recruit to those areas because they're already existing downslope? Probably. So it's not in the immediate cards to plant mangroves there, but at some point in the future, they might recruit, or we might reconsider that based on how the islands change with sea level rise. What is the master plan for Biscayne National Park? That's a big question. We are going through lots of different scenarios and trying to think about how our infrastructure will be changing, how our natural communities will be changing, how our shorelines will be changing. I can't really speak to a single master plan, but I do know that it's on everybody's mind, and it's being, lots of decisions are being made with climate change and sea level rise in mind. I'm not going to go into all of those now, but if you monitor the park, our communications that go out to the public, certainly we do talk about that topic. And I encourage you to try to learn more through that channel. I just don't have all the information here with me tonight. Meva, okay, Meva, absolutely. Be happy to have you come and help us again. Anybody else?
Looks like everyone has their questions in.
Awesome.
All righty, Amanda, thank you so much for coming in to talk to all of us today. I really hope that COVID stops being a hindrance to this work. I know that COVID put a hindrance on the restoration work that I was doing over at Virginia Key. So, it really lags everything, but it's really lagged everything behind. But I hope you're able to get on pace with it again, because this is really incredible and also very important work. So,
well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here tonight, and I love what I do, so I'm always happy to talk about it to anybody who will listen.
Awesome, great to hear. Well, thank you again, and thank you everyone for coming in. I really hope that everyone has a great Thanksgiving. Just 2 more days till everyone is hopefully feasting. So I hope everyone has a great Thanksgiving.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving.